On a grey morning in the port of Bristol, before the town had fully woken, the fog lay low across the water, settling over the masts like a held breath. It moved without hurry, this fog, curling around the rigging of ships that had not yet stirred, softening the hard lines of hulls into something closer to memory than matter. The light, what there was of it, came pale and reluctant through the mist, touching the tops of spars before it ever reached the cobblestones below. It was the kind of morning that seemed to belong to no particular year at all, morning that might have arrived a century before or a century after. So unchanging was the rhythm of the harbour at that hour, so patient the water against the stone. The River Avon moved slow and dark beneath the hulls, carrying with it the smell of tar and brine and the faint sweetness of rot that clung to every working port. Somewhere above the water, a ship's bell rang once, then fell silent, its single note swallowed by the fog before it could travel far. It was not an alarm, nor a summons, only the small ritual of a watch changing, a sound so ordinary to the ears of Bristol that it barely registered as sound at all. And yet it marked time in the way that mattered most to sailors and merchants alike. Not the time of clocks, but the time of tides, of departures and returns, of ships that left full of hope and came back empty, or did not come back at all. The timbers of the docks were salt-worn and grey, softened at their edges by decades of weather and the ceaseless friction of rope and boot. Dockhands moved among them without urgency, their forms half obscured by the mist, their voices low, exchanging the practical language of men who had done this work every morning of their working lives. There was no drama in their movements. They rolled barrels along the stone with the patience of men who understood that the sea did not reward haste, that the work of loading and unloading, of coiling rope and checking knots, was itself a kind of prayer against the dangers that waited beyond the harbour mouth. A gull cried somewhere above, unseen in the grey, and then another, and the sound drifted away over the water like something already becoming a memory. This was Bristol in the final years of the 17th century, sliding into the first years of the 18th, a city that had grown fat and restless on the trade of the wider world. Ships came into this harbour from Lisbon and Cadiz, from the Caribbean and the coast of Africa, from ports whose names carried the scent of spice and the weight of sugar, and whose holds, if one did not ask too closely, sometimes carried other things besides. The wealth of Bristol was built on distance, on the courage or desperation of men willing to cross an ocean that swallowed ships without explanation, that returned some sailors as wealthy men and others not at all. It was a city that understood, better than most, that fortune and ruin often travelled the same currents, boarded the same vessels, and disembarked at the same quays, one man, rich beyond imagining, another man's widow left only with a name struck from a ledger. It was in such ledgers, in fact, and not in any grand entrance, that the name first appears. Not in a captain's cabin, not upon a quarterdeck, not in the telling of any tale that yet mattered to history. It appears instead in the quiet ink of a shipping register, among the mundane records of a merchant house, a name entered alongside cargo manifests and harbour fees, alongside the names of other men whose fathers had built their lives on the movement of goods across water. Woodes Rogers. A name that meant, in that grey morning of fog and salt, almost nothing at all, not yet a captain, not yet a privateer. Not yet the man whose actions would one day reach into the warm waters of the Caribbean and quiet, for a time, an age of lawlessness that had made those waters infamous. In this early record, he was simply a merchant's son, born into a family whose business was the sea, in the way that other families' business was land or law or cloth, a family that had learned to read tides and markets with the same practiced eye. His father had been a ship's captain, and a man of some standing in the trade of the West Country, and it was in this world of contracts and cargo of insurance against loss and the constant calculation of risk that the young Rogers grew. He would have known, from an early age, the sound of that harbour bell, the particular grey of a Bristol morning, the way fog settled over rigging as though the ships themselves were dreaming. He would have understood, long before he ever commanded a vessel of his own, that the sea offered no guarantees, that a ship might leave harbour loaded with promise and simply vanish, swallowed whole by weather or war, or the quieter treachery of navigation gone wrong. This was the inheritance he carried, though no one watching him move through the streets of Bristol as a young man could have guessed at what he would become, could have read in his ordinary comings and goings the outline of a future in which he would sail around the world, rescue a marooned sailor whose story would outlive them both, and eventually stand as governor over an island so lawless it had earned itself the name of a republic of pirates. But that was still ahead of him, still folded into a future that the fog of this particular morning could not reveal. For now he was only a name among names, a young man moving through a world his father's generation had built, a world balanced precariously between the promise of empire and the shadow of everything empire required to sustain itself, the labour, the risk, the men who would sail to the edges of the map and sometimes not return. It was an age when the line between merchant and pirate, between legitimate trade and outright theft upon the water, could blur without much notice, when a letter of marque might transform a privateer into a hero of the crown, and its absence might just as easily transform the very same man into a criminal to be hanged. Fortune in this era did not distinguish cleanly between the lawful and the lawless. It simply flowed toward those bold enough or reckless enough to chase it across an ocean that kept its own counsel. Bristol itself embodied this contradiction perfectly. It was a city of merchants and magistrates, of church bells and counting houses, and yet its wealth depended entirely on ventures that stretched far beyond the reach of any magistrate's authority, ventures conducted in waters where the king's law existed only as a rumour, enforced, if at all, by the presence of a warship that might arrive months too late to matter. The same harbour that now lay quiet under fog would soon send ships toward the Caribbean, toward the coasts of Spanish America, toward waters increasingly haunted by men who had abandoned any pretense of loyalty to crown or country, choosing instead the black flag and the freedom, however brief. It was into this current, this precise mingling of empire's ambition and the sea's indifference to ambition altogether, that the young Wood Rogers would eventually sail, and through which he would come to leave his mark upon history, not merely as a merchant's son, but as the man who would help end an age. Yet the fog does not know this. Yet on this grey morning it simply drifts, indifferent to the names entered in ledgers below, indifferent to the futures being quietly assembled in counting houses and captains' quarters throughout the town. The bell rings again, distant now, marking some other small transition in the endless rhythm of the harbour. The dockhand pauses to wipe salt spray from his brow, glances toward the pale disk of sun trying weakly to burn through the mist, and returns to his work without comment. Somewhere among the moored ships, ropes creak softly against their cleats, the sound almost like breathing, almost like the harbour itself settling into another ordinary day among thousands of ordinary days that would eventually accumulate into history. If you find comfort in these quiet unravelings of old maritime mysteries, in voyages remembered slowly and without hurry, consider staying with us a while longer and perhaps returning again for the lost voyages yet to come. For now, the fog continues to settle over Bristol's masts, and the name of Woods Rogers rests quietly upon its ledger page, waiting, as all such names must wait, for the sea to decide what will be made of him. The world into which he was born was one where empire's hunger for gold and spice and dominion had created, almost as an afterthought, vast, lawless spaces upon the water, spaces where desperate men could reinvent themselves entirely, could become kings of nothing and everything at once, could vanish into legend or into the depths with equal ease. It was a world where a young man's ambition, once loosed upon such waters, might carry him toward wealth, toward ruin, toward a strange and unexpected fame, or toward all three in turn before the story was done. The harbour, patient as it always was, gave no sign of what it was about to release into the wider currents of the world. It merely waited, as harbours do, for the tide to turn. To understand a man who would one day sail against the pirates of the Caribbean, one must first understand the world that made piracy not merely possible, but in some strange way, inevitable. It was a world balanced precariously between order and chaos, between the Crown's authority and the sea's indifference to all authority whatsoever. The early years of the 18th century found Europe locked in a long and grinding contest, the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that had begun over a throne in Madrid, but had spread, as such conflicts do, into every corner where ships might sail and treasure might be seized. England and France and Spain and the Dutch Republic all found themselves entangled in a struggle that stretched from the fields of Flanders to the reefs of the Windward Islands, and in this stretching, something curious happened to the nature of the sea itself. For centuries, the ocean had been a place of trade, of fishing, of slow and patient commerce between distant ports. But war transformed it into something else, a vast and unregulated theatre where nations, unable to spare their naval strength for every distant errand, turned instead to private enterprise. Governments issued what were called letters of marque, documents bearing royal seals that granted ordinary ship captains the legal right to attack and plunder the vessels of enemy nations. A merchant captain, with the proper paper tucked into his coat, might become overnight a legitimate raider, sanctioned, celebrated even, so long as his prizes flew the wrong flag and his percentage found its way back to the crown. This was privateering, and it was a peculiar institution, half business and half warfare, existing in that hazy territory where legality bent without quite breaking. A privateer was not a pirate. This distinction mattered greatly to those who held the letters, and mattered rather less to those who found themselves boarded and stripped of their cargo. The privateer operated under license, the pirate operated under no one's authority but his own. Yet the two men might have handled the same ropes, fired the same guns, spoken the same rough dialect of the sea. Strip away the paper in a captain's cabin, and the same skills that made a privateer wealthy could just as easily make a pirate infamous. Many a man moved between the two identities as easily as changing coats, especially when a war ended and a letter of marque became overnight worthless, leaving a crew of hardened sailors with nothing but their training, their hunger, and their memory of easy plunder. It was into this shifting, dangerous economy that young Woodes Rogers would eventually sail, though his name meant little yet beyond the circle of Bristol's merchant houses. But before his story could unfold, the stage itself needed setting, and nowhere was that stage more vividly drawn than in the waters of the Caribbean. The islands of that sea were, by the early 1700s, among the most valuable pieces of geography in the entire world. Not for their size, many were small enough to walk across in a single day, but for what grew upon them. Sugar, that pale and glittering crystal, had become the engine of an entire economic system, more precious in some ledgers than silver itself. English plantations in Barbados and Jamaica, French holdings in Martinique and Saint-Domingue, all fed a growing European hunger for sweetness that showed no sign of abating. Fortunes were made and remade on sugar, and where fortunes existed, so too did the ships required to carry them home. Slow, heavy-laden vessels, moving along predictable routes, vulnerable to any who understood the currents and the shipping lanes. Alongside the sugar routes ran another current of wealth, older and more storied still: the Spanish treasure fleets, the great convoys that carried silver and gold mined from the mountains of Peru and Mexico back across the Atlantic to fund the ambitions of Madrid. These fleets had, for generations, captured the imagination of every sailor bold enough or desperate enough to dream of intercepting them. The waters between Havana and the Florida Straits, the passages through the Bahama Channel, the shoals and reefs that made navigation a matter of local knowledge rather than mere charts. All of this created a landscape where wealth and danger existed side by side, inseparable, each depending upon the other for its meaning. And amid the sugar islands and the treasure routes, along coasts too shallow for large naval vessels and too remote for consistent patrol, there grew a different kind of geography altogether, a geography of concealment. Small coves where fresh water could be found, and hulls could be careened against the sand. Channels known only to those who had sailed them a dozen times, twisting through mangroves and coral heads in ways that confounded any pursuer unfamiliar with their terms. These forgotten coastlines became havens almost without anyone intending them to be, simply because the alternative, the open sea, the naval patrols, the gallows waiting in every colonial port, made hiding preferable to fighting. It was here, in the growing shadow between commerce and lawlessness, that a certain culture of piracy began slowly to take root. Not yet the flourishing brotherhood it would become, not yet organized enough to draw the full attention of empires, but present nonetheless a scattering of crews, former privateers mostly, who had simply continued their trade after the paperwork that made it legal had expired or been forgotten. They needed no elaborate philosophy to justify what they did. They needed only ships and courage and a place to return to when the fighting was done. Far from these tropical waters, in the counting houses and coffee rooms of Bristol, England, another sort of culture was taking shape as well, one that would prove just as essential to the story, though its participants never felt the spray of salt water upon their faces. Bristol, by this period, had become one of England's great mercantile cities. Its wealth, built upon trade routes stretching to the Americas, to Africa, to the far reaches of empire. Its merchants were men of considerable ambition and considerable caution in equal measure. Men who understood that fortunes at sea were made not by those who sailed, but by those who financed the sailing. These were gentlemen who conducted their business from behind mahogany desks, polished to a high shine, in rooms warmed by coal fires, even in the depths of an English winter, far removed from any storm or cannon fire. They pooled their capital into joint ventures, spreading risk across many hands, so that no single loss might ruin any single investor. They read reports from distant harbours with the same careful attention a farmer might give to weather signs, calculating odds, weighing the return on a privateering voyage against its considerable hazards. They knew the language of the sea without ever having lived it, knew the value of a prize ship, the going rate for captured cargo, the percentage that would flow back to them should a voyage succeed, and the total loss they would absorb, calmly, should it fail. It was from precisely this world that the resources for daring expeditions emerged. Men of commerce who saw in privateering not adventure, but arithmetic, a percentage risked against a percentage gained. And it was this same world, this same class of measured, mahogany-desked ambition that would one day back a young captain named Woodes Rogers on a voyage that would carry him around the entire world, and later that would send him toward a distant island whose name was not yet spoken with any particular weight, though it soon would be. For, even now, in these years before that island's fame, whispers had begun to travel along the trade routes and through the taverns where sailors gathered to drink away their wages. Talk of a harbour somewhere in the Bahamas, shallow enough to keep out the larger warships of any navy, positioned close enough to the shipping lanes to make raiding practical yet remote enough that no governor's authority reached it in any meaningful way. A harbour beyond the king's reach, some called it, though not yet by any settled name that history would remember. It existed, in these early tellings, more as rumour than as fact, a place where a man who had turned pirate might find others of his kind, might trade information, might careen his ship, and drink his rum in something resembling peace, however temporary that peace might prove to be. This was the shape of the world as the 18th century began to unfold its early years. A world stretched taut between legitimate ambition and outright desperation, between the calculated risks of Bristol's merchant class and the immediate, visceral risks faced by the men who actually sailed the ships those merchants financed. Ambition and desperation in this era were not opposites so much as companions, often sharing the very same vessel, the very same crew, sometimes even the very same man, at different points in his life. A sailor might begin a voyage as a lawful privateer, serving king and country and shareholder alike, and end that same voyage, or begin the next one as an outlaw with a price upon his head. The transformation requiring no great moral upheaval, only a shift in circumstance, a war's ending. The sea did not care which man wore which label. It offered the same storms, the same becalmed days, the same chance of wealth or wreckage to privateer and pirate alike. What separated one from the other was often little more than paperwork, timing, and the particular temperament of whichever authority happened to be watching from a distance too great to intervene. And so the ships sailed on, in these years before Woodes Rogers ever took command of one himself, carrying within their hulls the same mixture of hope and hazard that had always defined life upon the water, a mixture that would before long draw him toward a distant harbour that history had not yet named, waiting as harbours do for its moment to arrive. In the late summer of the year 1708, two ships lay anchored in the river Avon, their hulls freshly caulked, their holds not yet filled with all they would carry before the tide allowed them to leave. The Duke and the Duchess, they were called, plain names for vessels that would come to carry a story far larger than their timbers might have suggested to anyone watching from the quay. The Duke was the larger of the two, some 300 tons, armed with 30 guns, and crewed by more than 300 men. The Duchess followed at her side, smaller, swifter, carrying perhaps 200 souls and 26 guns of her own. Together they represented an investment of considerable weight, not merely in timber and rope and iron, but in the fortunes of men who had never set foot upon a deck and never would. Behind these ships stood the merchants of Bristol, men whose names would appear in ledgers long after their faces were forgotten, men who had gathered in the warm rooms of counting houses to calculate risk against reward, tide against tide, war against peace. They had staked considerable sums on the expedition, enough to ruin several of them should it fail, enough to make several others considerably richer should it succeed. Thomas Goldney was among them, a Quaker merchant of quiet manner and careful judgment who had seen in Woodes Rogers not merely a captain, but a kind of instrument, precise and dependable, through which uncertain waters might be made to yield a certain profit. It was Goldney who had done much to assemble the financing, moving between the parlours of investors with the patient persistence of a man accustomed to waiting for tides to turn in his favour. The purpose of the voyage, as it was understood by those who funded it, was privateering, the harrying of Spanish shipping and settlement under the sanctioned violence of a letter of marque, a document that transformed plunder into patriotism, at least on paper, at least for those willing to see it that way. England remained at war with Spain and France both, a war that had dragged on for years already and would drag on for years more, and in such a climate, private ships armed with royal permission had become a kind of second navy, unpaid by the crown, but licensed to take what they could from the enemy's vessels and settlements, keeping a share for themselves and returning the rest to their investors. It was a business built upon violence, made respectable through paperwork, and Woodes Rogers, at 30 years of age, had been chosen to lead it into the far reaches of the world's oceans, farther than most such expeditions dared to travel, around the tip of South America, into the Pacific, toward the Spanish colonies that lined its eastern shore. And, if fortune allowed, onward still, completing a full circuit of the globe before returning home. The crews themselves were a study in contrasts, gathered from the taverns and docks of Bristol and beyond. Some experienced sailors who had spent decades upon the water. Others, men who had never before left sight of land, drawn by the promise of shares in whatever prizes might be taken. Among the officers was a name that would prove significant before the voyage's end. William Dampier, already an aging figure of some renown, a man who had circled the globe more than once before, whose knowledge of Pacific waters and Spanish settlements made him invaluable as a pilot despite a reputation. 4. Command decisions that had not always served him well in years past. Rogers had brought him aboard, not as captain, but as advisor, a subtle distinction that would matter greatly in the months to come, when questions of authority and judgment would surface again and again among men confined together upon the sea. On the morning the ships were finally ready to depart, the harbour at Bristol wore the soft light of early autumn, the kind of morning when mist still clings to the water before the sun has fully claimed the sky. Families gathered upon the docks in small clusters, wives and mothers and children who had come to watch husbands and sons and fathers disappear over the horizon toward a fate none of them could yet imagine. There would have been the usual sounds of departure, the creak of capstans turning, the shouted orders of boatswains, the flap of canvas being drawn up the masts, catching first weakly and then as the wind found it, filling with the particular fullness that sailors call by no poetic name, but which nonetheless carries within it something like the shape of hope itself. The ships eased away from their moorings, guided first by the river's current toward the Bristol Channel, and those who stood watching from the shore would have seen them grow smaller by degrees, masts and sails reducing to specks, until at last the land itself seemed to fold them away into the grey distance where sea meets sky and neither offers anything more to see. For Rogers himself, standing upon the quarterdeck of the Duke, the departure marked the beginning of an endeavour he had prepared for with characteristic thoroughness, though no amount of preparation could account for what the ocean itself might choose to offer. He carried with him a journal, begun that very day, in which he recorded not only the technical details of navigation and weather, but his own observations of the men under his command, a habit that would provide, in later years, trait, one of the clearest windows historians would have into the temperament of a man who otherwise revealed little of himself in casual company. His entries were measured, factual, free of the embellishment that other captains of the era were known to indulge in when recounting their own exploits. Where another man might have written of glory, Rogers wrote of wind direction, and the condition of the rigging of the daily allotment of water, and the health of the crew, as though the voyage were less an adventure than an accounting. Each day a ledger entry to be balanced against the next. The early weeks of the voyage brought the ship south along the coast of Europe, then out into the Atlantic proper, where the true nature of the journey began to reveal itself. Storms found them within the first month, not the catastrophic tempests that would sink lesser vessels outright, but the steady, grinding gales that test the patience of men far more than their courage, days of rain that soaked every garment and blanket aboard, nights when the ships pitched so violently that sleep became a rare commodity. Snatched in fragments between the lurching of the deck beneath exhausted bodies. Disease, too, made its appearance, as it always did on voyages of such length, the close quarters and poor diet conspiring to breed sickness among the crew. Several men died in those early months, their bodies committed to the water with whatever brief ceremony the circumstances allowed, their names entered into the log with the same careful, unembellished hand that recorded everything else Rogers thought worth remembering. It was during these early hardships that the disputes among the officers began to surface, small at first, the kind of friction that arises naturally when men of strong opinion are confined together for months at a time, with no relief in sight. Dampier's presence created a particular tension, for though he held no formal command, his experience commanded a certain deference from the crew that occasionally chafed against the authority Rogers himself was attempting to establish. There were disagreements over navigation, over the wisdom of certain courses, over how strictly the rationing of food and water ought to be enforced. Rogers, for his part, seems to have managed these tensions with a patience that many of his contemporaries might not have possessed, listening to counsel from multiple quarters before rendering decisions, and recording in his journal not merely what he decided, but often, as though anticipating that his choices might one day be questioned by men who had not been present to understand the circumstances that shaped them. The crew, too, watched their captain in these early months with the particular scrutiny that sailors reserve for men whose decisions will determine whether they live or die in the months ahead. What they found, according to accounts that survive from several who sailed with him, was a man who led not through bluster or cruelty, but through a kind of steady competence that inspired confidence more effectively than fear might have. He was firm when firmness was required. There are records of punishments meted out for insubordination, for theft, for the small infractions that inevitably arise among hundreds of men living in close quarters for months on end. But he was not needlessly harsh, and he seems to have understood, perhaps, better, that a crew's willingness to follow orders in moments of true crisis depended upon the trust accumulated during the long, uneventful stretches between such moments. Yet even careful leadership could not entirely dispel the small, persistent omens that began to accumulate as the ships pressed further from home. A mainmast on the Duchess cracked during a particularly violent squall, requiring days of labor to repair with materials that could scarcely be spared for such purposes. Whispers circulated among certain factions of the crew, never quite rising to open mutiny, but present nonetheless. Murmured complaints about rations, about the length of the voyage, about whether the promised shares of plunder would ever materialize into anything more than a sailor's hopeful fiction. Unknown sails were sighted on the horizon on more than one occasion, vessels that approached near enough to raise alarm before veering away into the vastness of the ocean, their intentions and allegiances never confirmed, leaving behind only the uneasy knowledge that the Duke and Duchess were not alone upon these waters, and that not every vessel they might encounter would prove friendly. Through all of this, the ships continued their long southward journey, carrying within them the accumulated weight of ambition and uncertainty that had launched them from Bristol months before. The men who sailed upon them had left behind wives who did not know if they would return as widows, children who might grow into adulthood before their fathers saw home again, merchants whose fortunes rode upon the safe return of vessels now reduced to specks upon an ocean too vast to easily imagine. And Woodes Rogers, standing his watches, recording his observations, listening to the counsel of men both wise and foolish, carried within himself the particular burden of command, the knowledge that whatever happened next, in these unmapped miles of ocean stretching toward the tip of a continent, the responsibility for it would rest in the end upon his shoulders alone. The islands of Juan Fernandez lay scattered off the coast of Chile like fragments of some larger landmass that the sea had long ago claimed for its own. Volcanic peaks rising green and steep from waters that ran impossibly clear near the shore and impossibly deep beyond it. Rogers had brought his ships toward this remote anchorage, not from any particular romance of the place, but from practical necessity. His crews were failing, scurvy had taken hold in the joints and gums of too many men, and fresh water and provisions were needed if the voyage was to continue at all. The charts he carried, imperfect as they were, marked this island as a place where such things might be found. A green speck of mercy in an ocean that had shown little of it thus far. It was the last day of January in the year 1709, when the lookout aboard the Duke called down that he had seen a light upon the island after dark, a small glow that appeared and vanished among the trees. And the officers who gathered to consider this news found themselves troubled by possibilities that ranged from the mundane to the alarming. Some among them thought it might be a Spanish garrison, in which case the island offered danger rather than refuge. Others wondered if French vessels might have preceded them, laying claim to the same waters for the same purposes. Few among them guessed the truth, which was stranger than any expectation they might have formed. For the island, as it happened, held not a garrison of any nation, but a single man alone, who had watched the sails of their approaching ships with an attention no lookout aboard the Duke could have matched. Having scanned this same horizon for years without reward, the boats went ashore the following morning, armed as a precaution against whatever the light might signify, and the men who rowed toward the beach found themselves met, not by soldiers, but by a figure who came bounding down toward the shore with a wildness of movement that suggested either great joy or great derangement. They could not at first sight distinguish which. He was dressed in skins, roughly fashioned and poorly fitted, his hair and beard grown long and matted in the manner of a man who had possessed neither razor nor shears for a very long time, and when he called out to them his voice carried an accent recognizably Scottish, though rusted, as it were, from disuse. The words coming slowly, as though he were relearning the shapes his own mouth was meant to make. His name, they would learn once his speech grew more fluent through practice, was Alexander Selkirk, and his story, told haltingly across the following days as he recovered something of his former ease with language, was one that the men of the Duke and the Duchess found themselves listening to with the particular quiet that accompanies an account almost too strange for ready belief. He had been sailing master aboard an English vessel some 4 years and 4 months previous, and finding that ship unseaworthy and her captain unwilling to hear his objections, he had asked to be put ashore on this same island rather than continue in a vessel he believed would founder. The request had been granted, perhaps with some relief on the part of a captain tired of his sailing master's complaints, and Selkirk had watched the ship depart with what he later admitted was an immediate and profound regret, a change of heart that came too late to be acted upon, the vessel already standing out to sea and beyond recall. What followed was a solitude of a kind few men have been asked to endure and survive. He had built himself 2 huts from pimento trees, one for sleeping and one for cooking, and had lived upon the goats that ran wild across the island, descendants, it was supposed, of animals left by earlier Spanish voyagers, supplementing this diet with wild turnips and the cabbage palm that grew in the island's interior. He had fashioned tools from what materials he could find, had read his Bible daily to preserve his command of English, and he said his soul alongside it, and had watched 2 ships pass in his years of solitude, both of them Spanish, from whom he had hidden rather than risked capture, knowing well enough what an English privateer's sailing master might expect at Spanish hands. The men who now stood before him listening to this account found themselves regarding him with a species of wonder that required no exaggeration to sustain itself. Here was a man who had outlasted his own abandonment, who had kept himself alive and largely sound in mind through years that might have broken lesser constitutions entirely. Rogers, for his part, recorded the encounter with the same measured attention he brought to matters of navigation and supply, noting Selkirk's condition, his account of his ordeal, the particulars of his survival, without embellishment beyond what the facts themselves provided. There was no need, he seems to have understood, to dramatize what was already remarkable enough in its plain telling. The ship's company saw to Selkirk's more immediate needs: proper clothing, a razor for his beard, food that did not require his own hunting to procure, and within some days he had recovered sufficiently in bearing, if not entirely in ease of manner, to be offered a position aboard the Duke, an offer he accepted. His skills as a navigator, too valuable to leave stranded upon the island that had so nearly become his permanent grave. None among them, weighing anchor once more, and standing out from Juan Fernandez with their rescued mariner, now numbered among the crew, could have known what this encounter would come to mean beyond its own immediate circumstances. Selkirk's tale, once carried back to England, would pass through the hands of writers and pamphleteers eager for material that combined the exotic with the true, and would eventually find its way transformed and elaborated into the imagination of a novelist who would give the world a castaway named Crusoe. His island adventures, drawn loose from the seed of Selkirk's genuine solitude and grown into something larger than the man himself could have anticipated as he stood upon that beach watching strange sails approach. But this transformation lay years ahead, unknown and unknowable, to the men who now simply counted themselves fortunate to have gained an able sailing master and to have witnessed firsthand a story that would bear retelling for the remainder of their lives, whatever shape it might later take in other hands. Voyage continued northward along the coast of South America, and the purposes for which the expedition had been financed now asserted themselves with fuller force. Spanish shipping along this coast represented the very cargo of wealth the investors in Bristol had dreamed of when they first subscribed their money to the venture, and Rogers set himself to the work of privateering with the same methodical care he had brought to every other aspect of the voyage. Small Spanish vessels were taken as prizes when circumstances allowed, their cargoes assessed and claimed, their crews treated according to the customs of the sea that governed such captures, not without violence, for privateering was no bloodless trade, but without the wanton cruelty that some accounts of the era's raiders might suggest was universal. Rogers held his men to a discipline that reflected both his own temperament and the legal nature of their commission, for a privateer who exceeded his license risked the gallows as readily as any pirate, and he was determined that whatever fortune the voyage yielded should be gained within the boundaries the law allowed. The greatest prize of the voyage, and the one that would define its financial success or failure, was the pursuit of a Manila galleon, one of the great treasure ships that carried the wealth of the Spanish Pacific trade across to Acapulco and back. Laden with silks and spices and silver in quantities that could transform the fortunes of any crew fortunate enough to take one as a prize. Two such vessels were encountered in the waters off California in the final days of the year 1709, and the engagement that followed cost the expedition dearly in blood, even as it yielded the treasure they sought. The larger of the two galleons resisted capture with a determination that inflicted real casualties upon Rogers's crews, and Rogers himself was wounded in the encounter, struck in the jaw by grapeshot, in a wound severe enough that for a time his own men feared for his survival, and severe enough that he would carry its marks and its consequences for the remainder of his life, his speech and his features permanently altered by the injury. The second and larger galleon ultimately escaped capture, her superior armament and resistance proving too costly to overcome. But the vessel they did secure, named the Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación Desengaño. though the English sailors would shorten this unwieldy name to something more practical for daily use. Carried treasure enough to justify the voyage's hazards several times over, silks and gold and coined silver packed into her holds in quantities that promised at last. The return the Bristol merchants had gambled upon when they first sent their ships out into waters. Few English vessels had dared to chart. Cost had been paid in blood, in Rogers's own disfigurement, in the deaths of crewmen whose names would appear in ships' logs and nowhere else, remembered by shipmates who would carry the memory home if they survived to make the journey. But the prize was taken, secured, and added to the growing wealth already accumulated across the long circuit of the voyage, and the ships that now turned westward across the Pacific, bound eventually for England by a route that would carry them around the whole compass of the world. Carried within their holds cargo enough to answer every question the merchants of Bristol had posed when they first weighed the risks of such an undertaking, and carried too, in less tangible form, a hold full of stories of a marooned Scotsman found upon a lowly island, of prizes won and galleons fought, of a captain's face marked forever by grape shot, that would follow the ships home across the wide, indifferent, and now well-travelled ocean. The ships that came at last into English waters in the autumn of the year did not arrive with the swiftness of triumph. They arrived slowly, as most things that have crossed the whole breadth of the world tend to arrive, weathered and patched and riding low with the weight of what they carried, and the men who stepped from them onto English docks did so with the particular unsteadiness of those who have spent too many years believing in the solid ground of somewhere else. Woodes Rogers came home, a wealthy man at least on paper, and came home too, a man whose face had been rearranged by the wars he had fought at sea, the jaw shot away, and rebuilt by whatever crude surgery a ship's carpenter and a desperate hope could manage. So that he spoke now, with a slight difficulty, that those who met him for the first time would notice, and then out of courtesy or discomfort, pretend not to notice at all. He had circled the earth. He had done what only a handful of captains before him had accomplished, had done it while fighting the Spanish and rescuing a marooned sailor and returning with prizes enough to make the voyage on its face a resounding success. And yet, the England that received him was not an England eager to reward him for it. The trouble was one that had followed men of the sea since long before Rogers had ever set foot upon a quarterdeck. The trouble of money, promised against money delivered, of shares and investments, and the tangled ledgers by which merchants measured risk against reward. The voyage had been financed by a company of Bristol investors who had put forward considerable sums against the promise of considerable returns. And while the ships had indeed come home with cargo, with silks and spices and the captured wealth of Spanish vessels, the process by which that cargo became coin, by which coin became profit, and by which profit found its way into the correct hands in the correct proportions, was one that dragged through courts and counting houses for years rather than months. There were disputes over what constituted a fair division of prize money. There were disputes over the conduct of certain officers, over decisions made in moments of crisis half a world away that now, examined at leisure by men who had never left England's shores, seemed to invite endless scrutiny and endless argument. Rogers found himself, upon his triumphant return, immediately and thoroughly entangled in litigation, his personal fortune, considerable though it may have been in principle, rendered largely inaccessible, tied up in the slow machinery of legal proceeding the way a ship might be tied up in ice, present and real and utterly unable to move. It was a peculiar kind of fame he wore in those years, the fame of a man everyone had heard of and few could quite locate. Financially speaking, he was invited to dine with men of consequence. He was asked to recount his adventures, the marooned Scotsman, and the burning of the galleon and the long, slow crossing of the Pacific, and he told these stories with the measured patience of a man who has told them many times before and will tell them many times again, watching the candlelight play across the faces of listeners who could not begin to imagine what it meant to stand upon a deck 3 years from any English shore. But when the dinners ended and the candles were snuffed, he returned to lodgings that were, by the standards of a man who had once commanded 2 ships and captured a fortune, distinctly modest, and he turned his attention once more to the courts, to the endless correspondence with lawyers and creditors, to the slow grinding process by which a man's paper wealth might eventually, if he were patient and if he were fortunate, become wealth he could actually hold in his hand. It was in this condition, celebrated, respected, and yet financially becalmed, that Rogers began to look about him for some new undertaking, some position that might restore not merely his fortune, but his sense of purpose. For a man who has sailed around the world does not easily settle into the small compass of London drawing rooms. And it was in this same period that his attention, along with the attention of increasing numbers of men in positions of authority, began to turn toward a set of islands far across the ocean that had, in the years of his absence, become something of a scandal to the Crown. The Bahamas had never been a particularly well-governed possession. They had been claimed and settled and largely neglected in the manner of many colonial territories, too poor in obvious resource to justify the expense of proper administration. And in that neglect, a curious vacuum had opened, one that men without scruple or law had proven remarkably swift to fill. Armitage, the chief settlement upon the island of New Providence, had by the time of Rogers' return become something considerably more troubling than a mere neglected outpost. It had become, in the plainest terms available to those who wrote reports upon the matter, a haven for pirates, not the occasional freebooter passing through, but an established and thriving community of men who had turned the abandonment of the place to their own advantage, who governed themselves after a fashion, who traded in stolen goods and captured vessels and lived, by all accounts, in a rough sort of prosperity that mocked the authority of every crown that claimed dominion over those waters. This was not, in itself, an entirely new phenomenon. Piracy had always existed at the margins of empire, feeding upon war and treaty and the gaps between one nation's law and another's. But something in the years following the Great Peace that had ended the long European wars had allowed this particular infestation to grow with unusual speed and unusual boldness. The peace, so welcomed in the capitals of Europe, had thrown out of employment vast numbers of sailors who had known no trade but war upon the water, privateers whose letters of marque had expired with the treaties that had authorized them, and many of these men, finding no honest berth willing to take them, had simply continued the only work they knew. Now, without the thin legal fiction that had once separated privateering from piracy, they had gathered at Nassau because Nassau offered what few other harbors could, a deep and defensible anchorage, a position astride the trade routes that carried Spanish silver and English sugar alike, and above all, an absence of any governing authority strong enough to trouble them. The reports that reached London spoke of hundreds of these men encamped about the harbour, of merchant ships taken almost within sight of other colonies, of a piracy grown so brazen and so organized that it had begun, in the alarmed language of certain petitions, to constitute something very like an independent nation of outlaws, sitting astride the empire's most valuable trade. Insurance rates climbed. Merchants who had once sailed the Caribbean with only ordinary caution now found themselves reckoning losses that threatened the very structure of colonial commerce. And the Crown, which had for some years regarded the matter with the distracted attention it granted most colonial affairs, began at last to understand that something would have to be done, that a problem allowed to fester at the edge of empire had grown large enough to threaten the center. It was into this climate of official alarm that Rogers, still entangled in his courts and his creditors, began to press his case for a very particular kind of appointment. He had, after all, spent years navigating the waters in question. He understood, as few men in London truly could, the geography of the islands, the temperament of the men who might be found there, the delicate balance between force and negotiation that any successful reclamation of the territory would require. He drafted proposals. He sought audiences with men of influence at court, men connected to the Lords Proprietors who held nominal authority over the Bahamas, and he argued with the particular persuasive force of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove that he was the man best suited to restore royal order to Nassau, to transform a den of thieves into a proper and profitable colony under the Crown's authority. The negotiations that followed were neither swift nor simple, for such things rarely are when they involve the layered authorities of proprietors and ministries and royal councils, each with its own interest and its own caution. But Rogers pursued the matter with the same patient persistence he had once applied to the crossing of an ocean, and in time, after petitions submitted and revised, after assurances given regarding the financing of the expedition, after the slow accumulation of official favor that such appointments require, he received what he had sought. He was to be made governor of the Bahamas, invested with authority to reclaim Nassau from the pirates who held it, to offer the king's pardon to those willing to abandon their unlawful trade, and to establish, where lawlessness had reigned, the ordinary. There was in this appointment an irony that did not escape the notice of those who understood the shape of Rogers's own history, though it was an irony spoken of quietly, if at all, in the official correspondence of the day. Here was a man who had himself sailed under something very close to the flag these pirates had abandoned, whose fortune had been built upon the capture and plunder of enemy vessels, under letters that distinguished his violence from theirs by the thinnest of legal margins. Now commissioned to hunt down men who differed from his younger self, chiefly in the matter of whose paper they carried and whose permission they lacked. He had been a privateer. He was to become the scourge of pirates. The line between the two had always been a fine one, drawn more by circumstance and sanction than by any difference in the deeds themselves. And Rogers, whatever his private thoughts on the matter, understood well enough that the men he was being sent to subdue were not so very different from the men who had once crewed his own ships, that they had followed much the same path from war to idleness to outlawry that had claimed so many since the peace. He set himself, nonetheless, to the preparation of this new expedition with the same methodical energy he had brought to his voyage around the world, though the character of this undertaking was entirely different in its aim. He was not sailing now for plunder or profit in any straightforward sense, not chasing galleons across an ocean in pursuit of prize money to satisfy investors. He was sailing to reclaim a port, to plant the authority of the Crown upon a shore that had, for too many years, answered to no authority but its own. Ships were gathered, soldiers were recruited. Pardons were drafted to be offered to those willing to accept them, and preparations made for those who would not. And as the autumn light shortened over the harbour once more, and the vessels of this new fleet took on their stores and their soldiers and their uncertain hopes, there settled over the whole enterprise a quiet foreboding, the sense shared perhaps by Rogers himself as he watched the loading of the ships, that whatever waited for him in the warm waters off Nassau would not yield easily to petition or pardon alone. To understand what woods Rogers would sail toward, it is necessary first to understand what had grown, in his absence from those waters, into something the maps did not name and the Crown did not recognize, a harbour that governed itself, that answered to no flag, that had become, in the years since the war's end had flooded the Caribbean with idle sailors and unemployed privateers, a republic of a peculiar and unrepeatable kind. Nassau sat upon the island of New Providence. its harbour deep enough for large vessels and shallow enough at its approaches to discourage the heavier warships of the Royal Navy from entering with confidence. This alone had made it valuable to smugglers and wreckers in the decades before piracy took hold there in earnest. But it was the Peace of Utrecht and the thousands of sailors it left without ships or wages that transformed the harbour from a smuggler's convenience into something far stranger, a town without a governor, without a garrison of any real strength, without the ordinary machinery of colonial rule. Into which drifted men who had spent years fighting for kings and now owed those kings nothing at all. They came first in small numbers, then in a flood, privateers whose commissions had expired with the war, sailors from merchant vessels grown weary of low wages and harsh discipline, runaway slaves who found, in the loose and desperate society of the pirate harbour, a freedom denied them everywhere else in the Americas, deserters from the Navy itself, men who knew the king's ships from the inside and carried that knowledge with them into their new lives. By the time the war had been over some 3 or 4 years, the harbour held, by the estimates of those who visited it, and later gave testimony, upward of 1,000 men living under no law but their own, a population larger than many of the Crown's official colonial towns. Gathered in a place that appeared, on the charts of the Admiralty, as a minor and largely abandoned settlement. The town itself, such as it was, had grown up around the ruin of a fort the English had built decades before and never properly maintained. Its walls had crumbled in places. Its cannon, those that remained mounted at all, sat in disrepair, their carriages rotted, their touch-holes rusted nearly shut. No governor had resided there in years, with the authority or the will to enforce the Crown's writ, and the fort's decay stood as a kind of monument to that absence, a ruin presiding over a town that no longer needed what it had once been built to defend. Around it had grown a haphazard settlement of huts and tents and salvaged timber structures, streets that were paths worn through sand and scrub, and taverns, always taverns, more taverns, it seemed, than any other kind of establishment, where the plunder of merchant vessels was converted with a speed that alarmed every honest trader who heard of it, into rum and company and the brief, loud pleasures available to men who did not expect to live long enough to save for anything else. And yet it would be a mistake, as some later observers insisted upon making, to imagine this town as pure chaos, a place without order of any kind. The pirates of Nassau had developed, in their own fashion, a system of governance that was in some ways more democratic than anything available to the common sailor in the legitimate service of king or company. Ship's articles, the written agreements that governed each vessel's conduct, the division of plunder, the compensation for wounds, the punishments for cowardice or theft from one's own crew, were debated and signed by every man aboard before a voyage began, and captains who violated the trust of their crews could be, and frequently were, voted out of command by the very men who had elected them. It was not liberty in any philosophical sense that these men pursued, but it was, in its rough and practical way, a form of consent that the merchant marine and the Royal Navy alike denied to the ordinary seaman. This too was part of what Rogers would be asked to end, though few in London troubled to understand it as anything more than banditry. The town's most famous residents, by the time Rogers's fleet was being provisioned in England, had already begun to take on the shape of legend, even among the sailors who caroused beside them in the same taverns. There was Charles Vane, a captain whose temper was as unpredictable as the squalls that rose without warning over the Bahama banks, a man both admired and feared by those who served under him, known for a fierce independence that would in time prove his undoing when it set him against the very negotiations that might have saved him. There was John Rackham, called Calico Jack for the striped cotton clothing he favoured, a man whose reputation would come to rest less on any single act of daring than on the 2 women who would sail with him, Anne Bonny and Mary Red, whose presence aboard his ship defied every expectation of what a pirate crew might contain, and whose names would outlast his own in the retelling of these years. And hovering over all of them, though he had sailed from these waters some time before, and would meet his own end off the coast of Carolina in a battle that history would remember more vividly than almost any other, Anna Keir, was the fading but still potent memory of Edward Teach, Blackbeard, whose brief and violent reign along this coast had done more than any other single figure to fix in the public imagination the image of the pirate as something between a criminal. He was gone from Nassau's harbour by the time these final years arrived, but his name remained, invoked by lesser men who wished to borrow some of his terror for themselves, and remembered by those who had known him with a mixture of respect and relief that he was no longer among them. For beneath the taverns and the legends, beneath the councils of captains who might vote a man into command one voyage and out of it the next, a change had begun to work upon this community that even its most committed members could feel, though few of them could yet name it. The prizes were growing thinner. The great years of plunder, when a single captured vessel might make every man aboard wealthy beyond any sailor's ordinary dream, had given way to leaner hunting, smaller ships taken, less valuable cargo recovered. The merchant traffic of the region grown more cautious and better escorted than it had been in the years just after the war. The Royal Navy, slow as it had been to recognize the scale of what was happening in these waters, had begun at last to send more frequent patrols, and though the ships of the pirates were often faster and better handled than the naval vessels sent to hunt them, the mere presence of those patrols added a weight of risk to every voyage that had not existed in the earlier years of the harbour's freedom. And there was beneath even this a deeper and more personal exhaustion beginning to settle over some of the men who had built their lives in this harbour. It is easy, from a great distance of years, to imagine piracy as an unbroken adventure, a life of constant plunder and reckless freedom. But those who lived it in these final seasons before Rogers's arrival knew it also as something else, a life without a future they could name, without any harbour in the wider world where they might walk freely and spend what they had taken without fear of the noose. Many of them were growing older. Some had begun to speak, quietly, in the corners of the same taverns where younger men still boasted of prizes yet to come, of a different kind of life, a farm somewhere, a small trade, a name that did not appear on any wanted notice posted in the ports of the Americas. This restlessness did not announce itself loudly. It moved through the harbour the way a change in weather moves through a fleet at anchor, felt before it is seen, sensed in the quality of the talk around the fires, at night in the diminishing enthusiasm for voyages that once would have been eagerly manned. It was into this uncertain mood, a town still populous, still governed by its own rough consensus, still capable of violence and defiance, but no longer entirely certain of its own permanence. That word began to arrive, carried by traders, and gossiping sailors and the occasional captured prisoner released to spread the news that the Crown had determined at last to act. A governor was coming, a man with royal authority, with soldiers, with pardons in one hand and warrants in the other. Some in the harbour dismissed the news as they had dismissed a dozen rumours before it. The Crown had threatened action against Nassau many times without ever following through. And there was no particular reason, to men who had built a life on scepticism toward all authority, to believe this threat would prove different from the rest. Others were less certain. They had heard, perhaps, something in the tone of the rumour that suggested this attempt would carry more weight than the ones before it. A fleet, not merely a proclamation. Soldiers, not merely a piece of paper nailed to a post. And so, in these last months, before Rogers's ships came into view of the harbour, the vessels of Nassau lay at anchor in numbers that still gave the appearance of strength, sloops and brigantines, and the occasional larger prize riding at their moorings in the pale green water, their crews moving between them and the shore, in the ordinary business of a town that did not yet know it was living through its final season as it had known itself. The fort's broken walls still stood watch, uselessly, over the harbour mouth. Taverns still filled each evening with noise and rum, and the boasting of men uncertain, whatever they told each other, of how much longer this life could continue. Somewhere among them, Vane still commanded a following that would not easily bend to any pardon offered by any king. Somewhere among them, Rackham was perhaps already circling toward the choices that would carry his name into legend and eventually to the gallows. The harbour breathed, in those last quiet months, with the strange stillness of a place that senses a reckoning approaching without yet being able to name its shape, waiting, as ships wait at anchor before a storm they cannot see, but somehow already feel moving toward them across the water. The ship that carried Wood Rogers toward that reckoning was named Delicia, a man-of-war of modest size but unmistakable purpose. Her guns run out not for battle but for demonstration, her decks crowded with soldiers whose uniforms had not yet grown accustomed to the salt air of the tropics. She was accompanied by a small fleet, the sloops and merchant vessels that carried settlers, supplies, and the machinery of a governorship that existed, as yet, only on paper and in the mind of the man who stood at her rail watching the horizon soften into the pale green suggestion of land. It was the latter part of July in the year 1718, and the waters through which the fleet moved had taken on that particular clarity found only in the far reaches of the Bahamas, where the sea turns the color of stone worn smooth by centuries, where one might look down from a ship's deck and see the shadow of the hull tracing itself across sand many fathoms below, where coral gardens drift past in blues and greens that seem almost to have been invented rather than found in nature. Rogers had crossed an ocean to reach this moment, had endured storms and the slow attrition of shipboard fever, had watched more than 100 of his soldiers and settlers die during the crossing from causes that seemed to gather strength from the crowded holds and the failing supplies of fresh water. He arrived, then, not at the head of a triumphant expedition, but at the tail end of a diminished one, his authority intact, but his resources thinned. His king's commission, a heavier document than the ship that carried it might have suggested. He stood at the rail in those final hours before landfall, watching the low shape of New Providence resolve itself out of the haze. The palm trees first, then the huddled roofs of the town, then at last the ruined outline of the fort that had once guarded the harbour, and now stood as a broken reminder of authority, abandoned. The approach was slow, as such approaches always were in waters thick with shoals and treacherous with sandbars that shifted their positions season to season, defying any chart drawn more than a year before. The fleet moved with the caution of ships entering a harbour they did not entirely trust. Sounding lines dropped and drawn up again, lookouts posted at the bow-calling depths in voices that carried thin across the water. And on the shore, word had already travelled, as word always travelled, faster than ships in a place where every man's livelihood depended on knowing what approached before it arrived. By the time Delicia's anchor found the bottom, the beach and the ruined walls above it were lined with men who had come to watch, some out of curiosity, some out of calculation, and some perhaps out of a need to see with their own eyes the shape of the thing that had been sent to end their world. Rogers came ashore not as a conqueror arriving under cover of guns, but as a governor arriving under the cover of ceremony, for he understood, as any man of his experience with company boards and royal charters would understand, that authority is often a performance before it is anything else. At the correct moment, before the correct assembly could accomplish what 100 cannon might fail to achieve through force alone, he stepped onto the sand of New Providence, with his officers arranged around him, the king's commission carried forward in the hands of a subordinate as though it were itself a kind of relic, and the pirates, for that is what the assembled men were, whatever else they might have called themselves in the years of their freedom, watched from the ruins of the fort and from the shade of the palms with expressions that mingled suspicion, curiosity, and the particular wariness of men who have learned not to trust anything arriving with the authority of kings. The reading of the pardon took place with a gravity that seemed almost out of place against the loose, sun-bleached disorder of the settlement around it. Rogers stood before them, a man not particularly tall, not particularly imposing, his face still marked by the fevers of the crossing, his clothes still carrying the salt of the voyage, and had the document read aloud in full, its language formal and distant, speaking of His Majesty's gracious pleasure, of the offer extended to all who had engaged in the trade of piracy in the years prior, that they might receive a full and free pardon upon their surrender and their solemn renunciation of that trade. The words moved through the crowd the way words move through a courtroom, formal and freighted, landing among men more accustomed to the language of contracts drawn between equals, the articles of their own ships, negotiated and signed and witnessed among themselves, than to the language of mercy extended downward from a throne 3,000 miles away. The silence that followed the reading was not the silence of men overwhelmed with gratitude, nor was it the silence of men cowed into submission. It was something more careful than either, the silence of men calculating, weighing the offer against what they knew of kings and their promises, against what they had heard of pardons granted and later revoked, against the plain fact that the harbour in which they stood had sustained them for years precisely because no such authority had reached it before. Some among the crowd exchanged glances, some looked toward the ruined fort, as if measuring what remained of the old defences against what Rogers had brought to replace them. And somewhere in that crowd, though no single account agrees on precisely where he stood or what expression crossed his face, was a man who would not accept what was being offered, whose name would come to embody the resistance that Nassau's surrender did not entirely extinguish. But many did come forward. In the days that followed the reading, a slow procession began, captains and their crews approaching Rogers's officers to lay down what weapons they carried, to give their names to the ledgers that would record their pardon, to accept in exchange for their past a promise of future respectability that some among them may even have believed. Benjamin Hornigold, who had once commanded the loose confederation of pirates that gathered at Nassau, and who had grown weary of the life, or perhaps simply calculating in his own way that the winds had shifted, came forward among the first, offering not only his own surrender but his services in hunting down those who refused to follow his example. Others followed for reasons less easily categorized, men worn down by years of hard living and harder fighting, men who had grown old in a trade that offered little in the way of old age, men who perhaps missed the ordinary textures of a life lived under some roof more permanent than a ship's deck, however loosely that life might now be reconstructed under a governor's authority. And yet, even as this procession continued, even as the ledgers filled with names and the beach grew quieter with each passing day, there moved beneath the surface of the settlement a current that Rogers could sense but not entirely master. For every man who came forward to lay down his weapon, there seemed to be another who slipped away in the direction of the mangroves, or who found reason to be elsewhere when the ledgers were opened, or who accepted the pardon with apparent sincerity only to vanish some weeks later aboard a sloop that had quietly taken on provisions and slipped out through the northern channel under cover of a moonless night. Rogers understood, even in those early days of apparent triumph, that a pardon offered to men whose entire identity had been built upon the rejection of exactly such authority could not be trusted to hold with the same certainty as a treaty signed between nations. He had won the harbour. He had not yet won the men within it, not all of them, and perhaps, If the truth were told in its fullest and least comfortable form, not even most of them in any way that would prove durable against the pull of the old trade once the immediate spectacle of his arrival had faded into the ordinary texture of daily governance. It was in this uncertain atmosphere, pardons granted, weapons surrendered, and yet an unmistakable undercurrent of calculation running beneath the settlement's surface, that Rogers began the work of rebuilding what piracy had allowed to fall into ruin. The fort above the harbour, whose walls had crumbled under years of neglect and the deliberate indifference of men who preferred an ungoverned shore, became the focus of his earliest and most urgent labour. He set his soldiers and such willing hands as he could muster to the work of repair, hauling stone and timber, restoring the platforms upon which cannon might once again be mounted to guard the approach that had for years welcomed rather than repelled. Slow work, conducted in a climate that sapped strength from men unaccustomed to its heat, and Rogers drove the effort forward with the same determination that had carried him around the world and back again, aware, as any man in his position must have been aware, that a fort half rebuilt was scarcely better than no fort at all, and that the appearance of order, however convincingly staged upon a beach crowded with newly pardoned men, was not the same as order secured. He knew, too, that the ships, still capable of putting to sea from Nassau's harbour, represented a danger that no ledger of surrendered names could fully account for. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the channels and inlets that laced the surrounding islands, men who had accepted his pardon in word were perhaps already reconsidering it in practice, drawn back toward the trade that had sustained them by the plain economic fact, offered rewards that honest trade in that thin and struggling colony could rarely match. Rogers walked the beach in the evenings, by his own later account, watching the lights of the settlement flicker against the deepening dark, aware that he had brought with him not a solution, but the beginning of a long and uncertain negotiation between the world he represented and the world that had grown up in its absence, a negotiation whose outcome, in those first weeks of his governorship, remained as unsettled as the waters through which his fleet had first approached, waiting, as the harbour itself seemed to wait, for the shape of what would come next to reveal itself in its own unhurried time. That shape began to reveal itself within days, and it arrived, fittingly, in fire. Charles Vane had not come ashore to accept a pardon. He had come to make a point, and he made it in the manner of a man who understood that certain gestures speak more clearly than any words entrusted to paper. On the morning the harbour first took full measure of Woodes Rogers' fleet, the guns run out, the flags raised, the new governor's authority made visible in wood and canvas, Vane was already moving. He had taken a French prize some weeks before, a ship of no great value to him beyond its usefulness now, in this moment, as an instrument of theatre. He filled it with combustibles, set it alight, and sent it drifting down upon the anchored warships, like a burning verdict on everything Rogers had sailed across an ocean to establish. The fireship came on slowly, as such things do, trailing smoke that caught the early light and turned it the colour of rust. Rogers' captains, no fools, cut their cables and manoeuvred clear with the practiced calm of men who had seen worse, and the burning hulk drifted harmlessly past, hissing where the water met its blackened timbers, eventually grounding somewhere in the shallows to burn itself out unattended. No ship was lost, no life was taken, but that had never been Vane's purpose. He had wanted the settlement to see it. Every fisherman, every wife waiting on a doorstep, every pirate weighing his own choice between the noose and the pardon, to see that the king's fleet could be made to scatter, however briefly, by a single man's contempt. And in the confusion that followed, in the small chaos of ships wheeling and orders shouted across the water, Vane slipped his own sloop out through a lesser channel, and was gone, vanished into the maze of quays and inlets that had sheltered pirates for a generation. leaving behind him a harbour full of anchored intentions and one very clear message that not every man in Nassau intended to be governed. Rogers received the news with the same composure he brought to most matters, though those who served closest to him would later say that something in his manner tightened after Vane's escape, a recognition, perhaps, that the pardon he carried, however generously worded, would not by itself be sufficient to close the account. Paper could offer forgiveness. It could not compel a man who had built his entire identity on refusing the terms others set for him. Vane was not the only such man in the harbour, but he was in that moment the loudest, and his flight into open water became a kind of standard around which the unpersuaded could imagine rallying, even as most understood, with the particular clarity that comes to men watching their options narrow, that there was nowhere left to rally to. What followed was not a battle. Rogers had expected, perhaps even prepared for, something closer to open conflict, a contested harbour, powder smoke, the grim arithmetic of siege. What he found instead was a slower and stranger negotiation, conducted not across battle lines, but across taverns and doorways, and the quiet calculations men make in the small hours when they are asked to weigh freedom against the rope. The pirates who remained, and most did remain, for all the fire and theatre of Vane's departure, were not, in the main, men eager for a final confrontation. Years of raiding had left many of them tired in ways that predated Rogers' arrival, tired of storms and short rations and the endless vigilance that piracy demanded even in its supposed golden hours. The pardon offered something that had grown difficult to imagine, a return to ordinary time, ordinary names, ordinary graves, rather than the anonymous sea. Rogers understood this, or came to understand it quickly, and he conducted himself accordingly, not as a conqueror demanding surrender, but as an administrator processing a queue. Men came forward in twos and threes, some defiant in manner, even as they signed, unwilling to let the moment look like submission. Others visibly relieved, as though a weight long carried had finally been set down. He took their names. He recorded their former commands, their ships, the rough tally of their crimes, not for punishment, but for the record, for the king's ministers, waiting across the ocean for evidence that the money spent on this expedition had purchased something more durable than a gesture. The harbour in those days took on the atmosphere of a court of accounts rather than a battlefield. Ledgers open on makeshift tables, men signing their names beneath the terms of a peace they had not fully chosen but had, in the end, agreed to accept. Not all of them did. There were holdouts, smaller in number than Vane's dramatic exit might suggest, but stubborn in their own quieter ways. Men who watched the queue form and chose, for reasons of pride or principle or simple distrust of any promise wearing a crown seal, to remain apart from it. Some slipped away in the nights that followed, following Vane's example without his theatre, taking what ships and men they could gather, and setting out for waters where the king's pardon carried no particular weight. Others stayed in the settlement itself, neither signing nor fleeing, a kind of suspended defiance that Rogers in those early weeks chose mostly to observe rather than confront, understanding perhaps that forcing the issue too quickly might undo the fragile momentum. And there were a few, a smaller number still, but enough to leave a mark on the settlement's memory, who chose the noose outright, or rather chose a course of action that led inevitably to it. These were men who could not, or would not, imagine a life inside the pardon's terms, who had perhaps committed acts too visible or too recent to trust that forgiveness would truly extend to them, or who simply could not reconcile themselves. When their trials came, in the months that followed Rogers' arrival, they went to the gallows with the particular composure that the condemned of that era were expected to display, some offering final words that were recorded and later circulated as cautionary pamphlets, others silent, having said whatever they intended to say, long before the rope was fitted. Rogers presided over these proceedings in his capacity as governor, and though the records give little indication of his private feelings in these moments, those who observed him described a man conducting a duty rather than savoring a victory. Grave, deliberate, present, at each hanging as the law required, but offering nothing of the theatrical severity that might have been expected of a governor eager to demonstrate his authority through spectacle. It is here that the moral weight of Rogers' position settles most heavily upon any honest accounting of his life, and it is worth pausing upon it, as he himself must have paused upon it in the quiet hours after each execution. He had not always stood on this side of the law. His own career before the governorship had involved privateering voyages, whose legality rested on the thinnest of distinctions from piracy itself. The same violence, the same seizure of ships and cargo, sanctified only by a letter of marque that made the difference between a hero's welcome. He had lived in his younger years by a code not entirely unlike the one he now enforced the death of. The men he sentenced were, in some essential sense, men he might have sailed beside under different flags and different fortunes, separated from him not by any fundamental difference of character, but by the accident of which side of a shifting legal line they had come to occupy. Rogers carried this knowledge, one imagines, the way any thoughtful man carries the knowledge of his own contingent virtue, quietly, without display, but never entirely absent from the weighing of each decision. This is not to suggest that Rogers doubted the necessity of what he did. The historical record shows no hesitation in his enforcement of the pardon's terms, no private correspondence suggesting a crisis of conscience over the executions he oversaw. He believed, apparently without much internal argument, that the pirate republic had to end, that the trade routes had to be secured, that the king's peace, however imperfectly it had been kept by the king's own agents over the years, represented a better order than the one Nassau had built in its absence. But belief in the necessity of an act is not the same as comfort in its execution, and the distinction between Rogers as privateer and the men he hanged as pirates was one that history had drawn more cleanly than conscience, perhaps, ever fully could. By the time the last trials had concluded and the last holdouts had either signed the pardon or slipped away into the wider Caribbean, Nassau's harbour had undergone a transformation that no observer of the previous years could have failed to notice. The great fleet of pirate vessels that had once crowded the anchorage, ships taken from a dozen nations, flying no flag but their own defiant absence of one, had thinned to almost nothing. Some had been seized and repurposed to the Crown's service, others had departed with vain, and those who followed his example scattered now across waters where Rogers' authority did not yet reach. A few had simply been abandoned, left to rot at anchor as their former crews chose the settled life the pardon offered, no longer needing the ships that had once been their entire world. The harbour that remained in the weeks after these departures wore a silence that struck those who remembered its former character as somehow heavier than the chaos it replaced. The taverns were quieter. The docks, once crowded with the business of outfitting and provisioning vessels bound for plunder, now saw the slower traffic of ordinary trade, or no traffic at all. Rogers himself, walking the same shoreline he had walked in his first uncertain weeks, found a settlement transformed, not yet fully remade into the ordered colony he envisioned, but no longer entirely the republic it had been either, suspended now between two identities, waiting as it had waited before his arrival, for the shape of its future to declare itself. The fireship's smoke had long since cleared from the harbour air. What remained in its place was a quiet that felt, to those who had known Nassau in its wilder years, almost like mourning. The quiet did not last, and those who had lived long enough on the island to read its weather knew better than to trust it. What came first, in fragments, carried by trading sloops and fishermen who had seen unfamiliar sails riding low on the southern horizon. Then, in firmer reports from vessels that had slipped past Spanish patrols in the straits south of Cuba. Spain had never accepted the English claim to the Bahamas with anything more than a resentful patience, and that patience, Rogers understood, had always been a borrowed thing, likely to be withdrawn the moment Spain judged the English settlement weak enough to be swept aside. The peace between the two crowns in Europe meant little in these waters, where old grievances persisted long after treaties had been signed an ocean away, and where a governor with failing resources and a garrison of uncertain loyalty made as tempting a target as any prize a Spanish admiral could hope to find. The first substantial word reached Rogers in the early months of 1720, carried by a captured Spanish sailor who, under questioning, spoke of a force being assembled at Havana, ships, men and guns enough by his account to erase the English presence from New Providence entirely and return the island to Spanish hands from which it had drifted. Wand in practical terms? Some years before, Rogers received the report with the same measured attention he gave to all intelligence, weighing the sailor's words against what else he knew of Spanish intentions, of the shipping lanes, of the season's winds that would carry any invading force north from Cuba toward Nassau's harbour. He did not know the exact day the attack would come. He knew only that it would come, and that when it did, the colony's survival would rest on preparations made in the weeks and months before the first sail was sighted. The fortifications Rogers had inherited upon his arrival had been modest, even by the standards of a settlement built more for trade and shelter than for war. The old fort above the harbour bore the scars of neglect, its walls crumbling in places, its cannon few and poorly mounted, its garrison, if it could be called that, composed of men more accustomed to raiding than to disciplined defence. Rogers had spent his first months attending to matters of governance, of trade, of the delicate diplomacy required to hold together a colony still uncertain of its own loyalties. Now, with the shadow of Spanish sails somewhere beyond the horizon, he turned his attention fully to the island's defence, and did so with the same methodical resolve he had brought to every other task since his arrival. He ordered the fort's walls rebuilt where they had fallen, using what stone and timber the island could provide, supplemented by ballast stones stripped from ships in the harbour and by coral rock quarried from the shoreline. The cannon that remained serviceable were repositioned to command the harbour's approach, their angles adjusted and readjusted as Rogers and his officers calculated, by lantern light and by daylight, both the paths a Spanish fleet would most likely take in approaching the town. Where cannon were lacking, Rogers sought them from passing merchant vessels, from sympathetic captains, from whatever source might yield a piece of ordnance capable of throwing shot far enough to trouble an approaching ship. It was slow work and imperfect, conducted with resources that never matched the scale of the threat being prepared against them. But it was work pursued without pause, week after week, as the season turned. The defenders themselves presented a challenge as delicate as the physical fortifications. Rogers called upon the settlers of New Providence, merchants, fishermen, the wives and sons of men who had once sailed under black flags, and found them willing, in the main, to take up arms in defense of a town that had become, whatever its irregular beginnings, their home. But he called, too, upon the former pirates who had taken his pardon, men whose loyalty to the crown remained, in the eyes of many, a matter of continued suspicion. Rogers had little choice in this. The garrison of regular soldiers he commanded was too thin, too diminished by disease and desertion, to withstand a determined assault without additional hands. And so he turned to the very men whose presence in Nassau had once represented the disorder he had been sent to correct. He armed them, positioned them along the walls and at the harbour's mouth, and trusted, with the same wary calculation he had applied to every dealing with the island's pirate population, that men who had little left to lose, and perhaps something now to defend, would fight as fiercely for Nassau as they had once fought for their own freedom upon the sea. The weeks of preparation passed in a rhythm of labor and waiting, the two states blending into one another until it became difficult to say where preparation ended and vigilance began. Watches were posted along the higher ground overlooking the harbor's approach, men staring for hours at an empty horizon, relieved and replaced as the sun rose and set again. Rogers himself, though his health had already begun the slow decline that would mark the remainder of his governorship, walked the fortifications daily, inspecting the cannon, questioning the watch, offering what reassurance a governor could offer to men who understood as well as he did. That no fortification built with such limited means could guarantee their survival against a fleet of unknown size. The attack, when it came, arrived in the manner such things so often do, not as thunder, but as a slow revelation, the darkness before dawn yielding shapes upon the water that resolved, as the light strengthened, into the unmistakable silhouettes of ships under Spanish colors. It was the 24th of February in the year 1720, when the watch atop the fort's walls called down word of sails approaching from the south, and Nassau, which had lived for months under the shadow of this possibility, found the shadow made suddenly, irrevocably real. The fleet numbered some dozen vessels, later accounts would suggest carrying several hundred soldiers and sailors, intent on retaking the island for Spain. They approached with the deliberate caution of a force that expected resistance but did not yet know its strength, standing off the harbor's mouth as the morning light grew, their sails catching the early sun, while the defenders within the fort watched in a silence broken only by the low murmur of officers confirming positions, checking powder, waiting. There is a particular quality to the stillness that precedes a battle long anticipated, not the stillness of ignorance but of readiness. Every man aware of what the coming hours would demand, and aware too that no amount of preparation could fully answer for what the enemy's guns might yet reveal. The Spanish ships began their approach toward mid-morning, working closer to the harbor under sail, and, where the wind faltered under oar, their intentions no longer in doubt. Rogers had positioned his forces to make the most of what limited advantage the fort's guns provided, concentrating his fire on the narrow channel through which any attacking vessel would need to pass. And it was here, as the lead ships came within range, that the first cannon fire opened, a single shot, then a ragged volley, smoke rolling low across the water in the windless morning air. What followed was neither swift nor decisive in the manner later myth would sometimes suggest, but a prolonged exchange conducted with the particular discipline of men who understood their circumstances too well to expect an easy resolution. The fort's cannon, worked by crews that included as many former pirates as regular soldiers, fired in steady rotation, the gunners reloading with the mechanical patience born of repeated drill, while splinters of timber and coral stone flew from the walls where Spanish shot found its mark. The defenders held their positions along the shoreline as well, muskets leveled toward the boats that attempted, at points during the engagement, to bring landing parties closer to shore. And here, too, the resistance proved firmer than the attacking force had perhaps anticipated. The former pirates among the defenders, fighting with a ferocity that owed less to loyalty toward the crown than to a plain unwillingness to surrender the island they had come, in their own irregular way, to regard as theirs. The battle continued through the better part of the day, the Spanish ships making repeated attempts to press closer to the harbor, and each time turning back under the weight of fire from the fort's guns, until, as the afternoon wore on, it became clear to the attacking commanders that the cost of pressing the assault further would exceed whatever gain the capture of Nassau might yield. The Spanish fleet withdrew before nightfall, standing off from the island, and then, over the following day, departing altogether, leaving behind a harbour scarred with the marks of the engagement, but a town that remained, against considerable odds in English hands. The cost of that survival was not slight. Rogers, whose health had already begun its long decline under the accumulated weight of tropical fever and the ceaseless demands of governance, emerged from the siege visibly worn, his constitution further eroded by weeks of strain that would never fully be repaired. Colony's already meager resources had been consumed at an alarming rate. Powder, shot, the provisions required to sustain a garrison through weeks of preparation and a day of sustained engagement, leaving Nassau's finances precarious even before the attack, in a state bordering on ruin. The victory, such as it was, had been bought at a price that the colony's ledgers would reflect for years afterward, in debts unpaid and supplies unreplenished, in a governor whose service to the crown had cost him more in body and in fortune than the crown itself seemed prepared to acknowledge. Yet Nassau stood. The harbour that had so recently rung with cannon fire returned in the days following the Spanish withdrawal to something resembling its ordinary rhythms. Fishing boats venturing out at dawn, traders assessing what damage had been done to the wharves, the fort's defenders, pirates and settlers alike, returning to the daily labours that governed island life. Rogers walked the fortifications once more in the aftermath, as he had walked them in the weeks of preparation before, taking stock, now, not of what might come, but of what had been endured, and of what the endurance had cost, a reckoning that would follow him in the years remaining to his governorship, like a debt that could be deferred but never fully discharged. The ledgers, when at last they were opened and set before him in the small stone room he used for correspondence, told a story that no siege could soften. Rogers had come to Nassau as a private citizen granted a public charge, and he had financed the greater part of that charge from his own diminishing fortune: the walls of the fort, the powder and shot that had answered the Spanish guns, the wages of soldiers who might otherwise have deserted for want of pay, the provisions that had kept a starving garrison from surrendering to hunger before it could surrender to an enemy. He had drawn against his own credit again and again, trusting that the Crown, having granted him the island and the mandate to reform it, would in time make good what he had spent in its defense. It was a reasonable trust, the kind any servant of empire might extend to the institution he served. It was also, as the years would demonstrate, a trust poorly placed. London, when the news of the siege's end reached it, received the report with the mild satisfaction of a distant power informed that a minor possession had not after all been lost. There was no great clamour of gratitude, no immediate dispatch of funds to settle what was owed. The Crown's attentions in those years were occupied elsewhere, with the shifting balance of European courts, with the perennial question of Spain, with 100 other concerns that made a small Bahamian outpost seem, from the vantage of Whitehall, a matter already resolved and therefore no longer urgent. The men who had approved Rogers' commission, who had spoken so warmly of restoring order to the islands and driving out the pirate scourge, found themselves less warm when the invoice for that restoration arrived on their desks. Promises made in the enthusiasm of a plan's conception have a way of cooling in the long interval before its execution is billed. And Rogers, having executed the plan at considerable personal cost, discovered that enthusiasm and reimbursement rarely travel at the same speed. He remained in Nassau for a time after the siege, continuing the work of governance as though the debts accruing against his name were a private matter separate from the public good he still believed himself to be securing. He oversaw the repair of the fortifications damaged in the fighting. He continued the slow, unglamorous labor of building something resembling civil order, courts, however rudimentary, and the beginnings of trade conducted under something other than the law of the cutlass. He wrote to London with the patient insistence of a man who believed that patience would eventually be rewarded, that the accounts would be settled once the proper officials had time to review them, that the Crown he had served so faithfully would not simply allow him to bear the cost of an empire's negligence. He was, in this, a man of his era, one who believed in institutions, even as those institutions gave him ample cause for doubt. But belief does not repay creditors, and Roger's creditors were neither patient nor institutional. They were merchants and lenders in Bristol and London who had extended him credit on the strength of his reputation and the promise of crown reimbursement. And when that reimbursement failed to materialize on any timely schedule, they pressed their claims with the ordinary urgency of men owed money. By the time Rogers returned to England, his health already diminished by years in a climate that wore hard on constitutions built for cooler latitudes. His fortune spent in service of a colony whose value to the crown had never been matched by the crown's willingness to fund it. He found himself a man surrounded not by the deference owed a former governor, but by the demands owed a defaulting debtor. The fall, when it came, arrived with the quiet, grinding inevitability of legal process rather than the drama of sudden ruin. There was no single catastrophic collapse, no dramatic seizure of goods before a crowd of onlookers. There was instead the slow accumulation of writs and summons, the methodical work of courts, designed to extract payment from those who could not provide it, and at the end of that process, a debtor's prison, the ordinary fate reserved in that century for men whose obligations exceeded their means. Regardless of how nobly or how faithfully those obligations had been incurred. Woodes Rogers, who had commanded a privateering fleet around the circumference of the earth, who had faced down pirate captains and Spanish men of war and the mutinous grumbling of his own crews, who had governed an island, wrested from lawlessness through the sheer persistence of his will, too, found himself confined within walls far less imposing than the fort at Nassau, held not by soldiers but by ledgers, not by an enemy's cannon, but by the arithmetic of unpaid accounts. There is a particular quality of humiliation in this kind of confinement, one that differs from the dangers Rogers had faced at sea or under siege. A storm or a broadside offers at least the dignity of a worthy adversary. The ocean does not care about a man's rank, but neither does it hold him in contempt. Debt, by contrast, carries with it the low murmur of judgment, the implication that the debtor has failed at something a more careful man might have managed. For Rogers, whose failures were not failures of prudence, but failures of an empire too slow and too indifferent to pay its own bills, the injustice must have sat particularly heavy. He had not squandered his fortune on excess or vanity. He had spent it holding a fort against an invading fleet, keeping a garrison fed, maintaining the very possession the crown claimed to value. And for this, he sat now among debtors, whose circumstances bore no resemblance to his own, men ruined by drink or poor investment or simple misfortune, none of whom had spent their last resources defending a piece of England's dominion in the Caribbean from the Spanish Empire itself. The historical irony of this arrangement is not subtle, and it does not require embellishment to feel its weight. Pirates, in the long record of their operation, have shown a persistent tendency to demand sacrifice from those who serve them and to offer, in return, only the thinnest guarantee of eventual gratitude. The soldier who holds a distant post, the administrator who enforces an unpopular policy, the governor who spends his own fortune because the crown's fortune arrives too late, or not at all, these are the figures history remembers when it remembers them, with a kind of retrospective fondness that was rarely extended to them while they lived. Rogers had done precisely what an empire asks of its servants. He had improvised where the crown had failed to plan. He had spent where the crown had failed to fund. He had held a position the crown itself had underprepared for the holding. And having done so, he was left to discover that an empire's gratitude, unlike its demands, is not something that can be relied upon to arrive on schedule, if it arrives at all, said. The years that followed his release, whenever precisely that release came, and however it was arranged, were years of a quiet and almost deliberate obscurity. Rogers did not vanish entirely from the record. Men of his former prominence rarely do, not completely. But he receded from the kind of attention that had once made him a figure worth writing about in the coffeehouses of London, worth discussing in the same breath as the pirates he had helped subdue. The pamphlets and broadsides that had once carried his name in connection with grand ambitions of imperial reform grew quieter on the subject. The correspondence between colonial officials, once concerned with his governorship and his requests for funds, moved on to other matters, other men, other problems requiring London's limited attention. Rogers persisted, but he persisted in the manner of a man whose most significant work was already behind him, waiting, perhaps still hoping, in whatever quiet way a proud man permits himself to hope, for some eventual acknowledgement of what he had done and what it had cost him. Nassau, meanwhile, continued, much as he had left it. The order he had imposed did not immediately collapse in his absence, a fact that speaks to the genuine durability of what he had built, however little credit he received for building it. The fort he had strengthened still stood. The settlers who had taken his pardon still largely kept to the terms of it. The pirates, who had once made the harbour a haven for lawlessness, had, for the most part, either been hanged, had fled to other waters, or had settled into the uneasy respectability of subjects under a crown they had once defied. The island endured under the shape of his former order, even as his own name faded from the conversations of the men who governed it from across the ocean, a peculiar kind of vindication, if vindication is the right word for watching your work outlast your own recognition. There is a particular sorrow in this pattern, one that recurs often enough in the history of empires to seem less an anomaly than a design. The architects of order are so often discarded once the order itself no longer requires active tending, once the walls are built, once the garrison is settled, once the pirates are hanged or pardoned and the trade routes run more or less as intended. The empire that required a man's fortune and his health to secure a distant possession has little further use for that man once the possession is secured. And history, which is written largely by those who benefit from stability rather than those who purchased it, tends to remember the stability. Woodes Rogers, in the years of his obscurity, became a small and largely unremarked casualty of this pattern, a man who had done precisely what was asked of him, and who was left, for his trouble, to reckon a debt that the empire he served would take its own long, indifferent time in ever fully repaying. The years that followed his return from the Bahamas had not been kind to him, and it would be some time yet before they turned toward anything that might be called kindness at all. He had spent what remained of his fortune in the service of a colony that the Crown had been glad enough to claim once it was secured, and he had watched that fortune dissolve into the accounts of creditors who cared nothing for the storms he had weathered or the pirates he had faced down on a beach at Nassau, with nothing but a commission, stubborn nerve to recommend him. There had been a debtor's confinement, brief but bitter, and there had been the long grey period after it, kind of obscurity that settles over a man who has done something remarkable and then discovers that remarkable deeds do not by themselves keep a household fed or a name spoken of in the rooms where decisions are made. He grew older in this obscurity. He grew thinner by most accounts, and the illnesses that had first taken hold of him in the humid air of the islands did not entirely release their grip, even in the cooler climate of England. He was, by the accounts that survive, a man who walked with less certainty than he once had, who spoke sometimes of the Bahamas, not as a burden he had escaped, but as a country he had left unfinished, the way a builder might speak of a house whose roof was never quite completed before the money ran out. It is one of the quieter turns of this history that the neglect did not last forever. The colony he had governed, the one he had wrested from the loose confederation of pirates, who had called it their own republic, had not entirely thrived in the years since his departure, and the governors who followed him found the work of holding it together no easier than he had. Reports drifted back to London of laxity, of old habits resurfacing in the absence of the man who had first broken them, of a settlement that without firm hands might slide back toward the condition in which he had found it. And so, in the slow and unglamorous way that empires sometimes correct their own oversights, the matter of Woodes Rogers came up again in the rooms where such matters were decided. There was no grand ceremony to it, no public reckoning of the debt owed him, only a quiet recognition, arrived at after years of silence, that the man who had once cleared Nassau of its raiders might be the only man suited to holding it clear a second time. He was granted in the later years of his life a second commission as governor of the Bahamas, and he accepted it by all appearances without bitterness, though one imagines that a man who had given so much for so little return might have been forgiven a measure of weariness at being asked to give again. He was older now, and the portraits and descriptions that survive from this period show a man changed from the one who had sailed into Nassau harbour with his small fleet years before, thin where he had been broad, careful in his movements where he had once carried himself with the unthinking vigour of a man who had circled the globe and buried his own brother at sea without breaking stride. The islands too had changed, though less dramatically than might be supposed. Nassau was no longer the lawless republic it had been in the days of Vane and Blackbeard and the loose confederation of men who had governed themselves by nothing but appetite and the accident of shared circumstance. It had become, in the intervening years, something closer to an actual settlement, modest, still poor, still vulnerable to storm and Spanish raid and the general indifference of an empire that valued it chiefly for its position, but no longer a haven for the kind of organized piracy that had made its name a byword for disorder throughout the Caribbean. The Fort Rogers had once repaired with borrowed labor, and his own stubborn insistence still stood, weathered further by the years but serviceable. The houses had multiplied somewhat. There were more families now, more of the ordinary business of a colony. Trade in salt and dyewood, the slow accretion of the mundane transactions that mark a place as settled rather than merely occupied. It was, in other words, a fragile steadiness rather than a secure one, and Rogers, returning to it in his diminished health, seems to have understood this distinction better than most. He did not attempt, in this second governance, the kind of dramatic confrontation that had marked his first arrival. There was no fleet of former pirates to be pardoned en masse, no standoff on a beach with men who might at any moment decide that violence was preferable to submission. The work of this second term was smaller and quieter, the work of maintenance rather than conquest, of tending a fire that had already been lit rather than striking the first spark. He oversaw repairs to the fortifications that had begun to crumble again in his absence. He worked with the same patient attention to detail that had characterized his earlier logs and correspondence to regularize the colony's finances, to ensure that the meager revenues of the settlement were accounted for honestly, to reduce where he could the petty corruptions that tend to accumulate in any distant outpost where oversight is thin and temptation is constant. He corresponded with London on matters of defense, aware that the Bahamas remained exposed to Spanish raid and that the peace of the islands was never so secure as the reports of steady commerce might suggest. None of this was the stuff of legend. It was the unglamorous labor of governance performed by a man whose body was failing him, but whose sense of unfinished obligation had apparently not diminished with the years. There is a particular kind of dignity in this quiet finishing of a task, a dignity that does not announce itself, and is easily overlooked by histories more interested in the drama of confrontation than the patience of maintenance. Rogers had been, in his first term, the man who ended something, who broke the back of the pirate republic and drove its remaining defiant elements into flight or death. In his second term, he became the man who simply continued something, who understood that having built a foundation, he was now obliged to see that it did not crumble for want of tending. He made small reforms where he could. He attended to the training and provisioning of what militia the colony could support. He worked to encourage the kind of legitimate trade that might in time give the Bahamas an economic life independent of its usefulness as a strategic outpost. None of these efforts was sufficient to transform the islands into a thriving possession. That transformation would not come for generations yet, if indeed it could be said to have come at all in the terms Rogers might have imagined it, but they were sufficient to hold the colony steady, to keep it from sliding back into the disorder from which he had first rescued it. He did not live to see whatever fuller flowering his efforts might eventually have produced. His health, already compromised by the accumulated hardships of a life spent largely at sea and in tropical climates unfriendly to a European constitution, continued its slow decline through these final years of service, and in the year 1732, the island he had first taken by negotiation and then held by force, and had now returned to govern a second time in his diminished age, Woodes Rogers died. He was buried there, in the town he had done so much to shape, and so little been rewarded for shaping, his grave marked simply, without the grandeur that might have seemed fitting for a man who had circumnavigated the globe, rescued a castaway who would become the model for the most enduring castaway story in the English language, and broken the back of organized piracy in the Caribbean through nothing but nerve, negotiation, and a stubborn refusal to be moved from a position he had decided to hold. The exact location of that grave would, in time, become uncertain, its precise marker lost or worn away in the manner that so often overtakes the resting places of men whose fame was tied more to their deeds than to any lasting monument raised in their honor. What remains certain is the fact of it, that he was buried in Nassau, in the soil of the island. He had first approached as a naval commander with a royal commission and a fleet of former enemies uneasily reformed into subjects, and to which he had returned, years later, worn thin by service and debt and illness, to finish what he had begun. The waters he had once sailed as a privateer circling the globe, and later as a governor facing down a beach full of armed and uncertain pirates, lapped now at the shore, above which his grave, however modest, however eventually obscured by time, looked out. He had come to the Bahamas twice, once as a man of ambition seeking to make his fortune and his name through the taming of a lawless place, and once as an old man seeking only to hold together what he had made without the expectation of further reward. The island had taken his health, his fortune, finally his life, and had given him in return only the quiet distinction of being remembered, imperfectly, unevenly, but remembered nonetheless as the man who had ended, more than any other single figure, the golden age of piracy in the waters. The years that followed his death moved the way years always move over a harbour town, slowly erasing the sharp edges of what had happened, smoothing them into something softer, something that could be spoken of without the weight of having lived through it. Nassau continued. Ships still came and went from its harbour, and the fort he had rebuilt with his own failing strength stood watch over waters that had by then largely forgotten what it meant to fear a black flag on the horizon. This was perhaps the truest measure of what Woodes Rogers had accomplished, not the monuments raised to him, for there were few, and not the songs written of him, for there were fewer still, but the simple, undramatic fact of ships arriving safely, of cargo reaching its intended port, of merchants no longer needing to calculate the likelihood of losing their vessel to men who answered to no crown. The absence of piracy, once he had broken its back in the Bahamas, became so ordinary that it ceased to be remarked upon at all. And there is a particular kind of historical irony in this, that a man's greatest success can become invisible precisely because it succeeds, because the very thing he eliminated leaves no further evidence of the danger it once posed. The golden age of piracy did not end with a single battle or a single treaty. It ended in the slow accumulation of quiet harbours, in the gradual return of trade routes to predictability, in the fading of a fear that had once gripped merchant captains from Bristol to Charleston to the coast of Africa. Rogers had set that erosion in motion, and though other governors and other naval patrols would continue the work in the years after him, it was his arrival in 1718, his offer of pardon, his willingness to fight when pardon was refused, that marked the turning of the tide. And yet history, when it came to remember him, did so unevenly, the way a tide leaves some things exposed on the sand and buries others beneath it. The pirates he had hunted, Blackbeard, Vane, Rackham, Bonny, and Reed, became names that would echo far beyond their brief and violent lives, romanticized in ballads and later in books and films, transformed into figures of a peculiar kind of admiration. As though the men and women who had preyed upon merchant vessels and terrorized coastal towns had become, through the simple passage of centuries, something closer to folk heroes than to the criminals they were understood to be in their own time. Their names carried a music that his did not. Blackbeard's very appearance, the smoking fuses in his beard, the theatre of terror he cultivated, was designed to be remembered, and it was long after the man himself had been reduced to a head hanging from the bowsprit of a naval sloop. Rogers had no such theatre. He was a merchant's son who became a privateer, who became a governor, who spent his own fortune and his own health in service of an empire that repaid him with debtor's prison and half-hearted recognition. There was no drama in his methods, only persistence. The setting of a garrison, the building of a fort, the slow correspondence with distant lords who did not always answer, the patient endurance of yellow fever and financial ruin. Persistence does not make for good balladry. It makes for footnotes, and it was largely as a footnote that Rogers passed into the historical memory of the very age he had helped to end, mentioned, when he was mentioned at all, as the man who accepted Blackbeard's surrender, or the man who governed the Bahamas twice, a supporting figure in a story whose central characters were the pirates themselves. It is worth pausing on this, in the quiet of what remains, because there is something almost cruel in the shape of it, that the men whose violence he ended became more vivid in memory than the man who ended it, that romance clings more easily to piracy than to the tedious, expensive, unglamorous work of restoring order. But perhaps this unevenness is not an accident of memory, so much as a reflection of what people wish to remember. A pirate offers a story of defiance, of men and women who refused the constraints of empire and made their own law upon the sea, however brief and however doomed that freedom may have been. A governor offers a story of institutions reasserting themselves, of empire closing back over a gap it had briefly lost control of, and institutions, however necessary, rarely inspire the kind of longing that outlaws do. Rogers understood something of this himself. In the last years of his life, when he watched younger men receive commissions and honors, he felt he had earned first and more thoroughly. He had written, in one of his final petitions to the Crown, of the injustice of being forgotten while he yet lived, of watching his own service become a matter of historical record rather than present gratitude. He could not have known, writing those words in the fevered air of Nassau, how much further that forgetting would extend, how thoroughly the pirates he had defeated would come to overshadow him in the centuries that followed. There is a paradox in his life that deserves its own quiet meditation, separate from the question of how history chose to remember him. The paradox of a man who had himself once sailed under something close to the same freedoms he later worked to extinguish. His voyage around the world had been a privateering expedition, sanctioned by the Crown, yes, but built upon the same fundamental logic that animated piracy: the seizure of enemy shipping, the taking of prizes, the violence of ships meeting at sea with cannon and boarding party. The line between privateer and pirate had always been a legal fiction more than a moral one, a matter of whose flag one sailed under and whose enemies one attacked, and Rogers had walked that line himself, in his younger years, taking Spanish treasure across the Pacific with the same boldness that Blackbeard would later bring to the waters of the Carolinas. He was not a stranger to the ambiguity he was later tasked with eliminating. He had lived inside it, had profited from it, had commanded ships whose legal sanction was a matter of paperwork more than principle. And when he arrived in Nassau as governor, he arrived not as a man untouched by the ways of the sea's outlaws, but as one who understood them intimately, who could recognize in Vane's defiance and in Hornigold's calculation the same instincts that had once guided his own voyage into Spanish waters. Perhaps this was why he succeeded where a purely naval officer might have failed. He knew what these men wanted, knew the shape of their ambitions and their fears, because he had once wanted similar things himself under a different flag and a different name for the same violence. And there is the further paradox that the empire he served with such cost to his own body and fortune would treat him, in the end, with such indifference, that the savior of a colony, the man who had broken the back of piracy in the Bahamas at the price of his health and his wealth, would spend years in a debtor's prison for obligations incurred. In that very service would die, still owed money by the crown he had served twice over. He was, in this sense, both hunter and casualty, a man who ended one form of predation only to be consumed, more slowly and less dramatically, by the predations of empire and commerce that had sent him there in the first place. The debts that followed him were not so different, in their essential nature, from the debts that drove men to piracy in the first place. The gap between what was promised and what was paid, between service rendered and reward received. Rogers had hunted men who took by force what the legitimate economy denied them, and he himself was, in the end, denied by that same economy the full measure of what his service had earned. It is a quiet and unglamorous tragedy, without the violence of a pirate's death, but a tragedy nonetheless, the kind that history rarely pauses to mourn. And so the fog returns, as it always does in the telling of these things. The fog that lay over Bristol harbour on the morning his ship first departed for the world's turning, thick and grey and indifferent to the ambitions being carried out through it. It was the same fog in its essential nature that would later lie over Nassau's harbour in the quiet hours before dawn, the same mist that rises from any body of water, indifferent to what has happened upon it or beside it. The sea does not remember, Woodes Rogers does not remember Blackbeard, does not remember the pardoned pirates or the ones who refused pardon and died for their refusal. It continues in its slow work of tide and current, indifferent to golden ages, beginning or ending upon its surface, indifferent to forts built and abandoned, to governors who arrive with ambition and depart, if they depart at all, diminished. The sea outlives every ambition placed upon it, every voyage undertaken in its name, every empire that sought to claim its waters as its own. It was there before Rogers sailed into it, and it remained after he was buried in the small graveyard that has itself since faded into uncertainty, and it will remain long after this telling of his story has been heard and set aside. This has been another chronicle from the quiet edges of history, offered gently for those still listening in the dark. If these lost voyages have offered you some measure of rest, you are welcome to seek out others like it on this channel, where more ships wait in the fog and more names wait to be remembered, unevenly perhaps, but remembered still. Sleep well and let the tide carry what remains.